Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? The stages of the PPP process: project identification to operations.
Hello, my name is Edward Farquharson. I work at the European PPP Expertise Centre in the European Investment Bank. I'm going to give you an overview of the steps involved in taking a project from concept to its operational stage. This is often referred to as the project cycle. Essentially, it is a process map that can be applied to all forms of PPP to help a government think through and identify what needs to be done by the public authority and when. It can essentially be broken down into four main steps or phases: a project identification phase, a detailed preparation phase, then the procurement phase, and finally the implementation phase for the project. One of the benefits of taking a stepped approach is that it enables you to build in quality control checkpoints as you go through the process. For example, it could ensure that you have checked that the public partner has the legal powers to enter into a contract at an early stage. You don't want to be addressing this sort of issue later on in the PPP process. Usually the authority responsible for delivering the public service need will own this process throughout. But in some countries, the detailed preparation and procurement stages might be carried out by a specialist public sector department. PPP units can also play an important technical support role or a review quality role in this process as well. Now, while you might have a series of different steps, it is also useful to have a checklist in mind of the key objectives to consider throughout the process to ensure that these are still being achieved. There are probably 5 key areas, or nagging questions if you like, that should be asked throughout the process as the project takes shape. The first would be to ensure that you still remain able to meet the fundamental need for which the project is required. Does the project still make economic sense? Does the project still make commercial sense? Am I still able to pay for the project? And can one still manage the process? Achieving one objective often has an impact on another. For example, if the expected costs change during the process, say they go higher, is the project still affordable? But if it's not, will you need to reduce the scope of the project? But if you reduce the scope of the project, will it still meet its underlying needs? This is a fundamental benefit of this approach to looking at these key objectives together, because it enables you to keep them in balance. Now let's look at the project cycle phases in more detail. The first step, the fundamental step, is really to make sure that the need for the project is well grounded. For example, in some of the early health projects in Latin America that I was involved in, they were well delivered and well managed projects, but the incentives to use the hospital services were not in place, and the facilities ended up being underused. You don't really want to change your mind about the need for the project later on. Once we know where we want to get to, the next step is, how do we get there? The next step will usually involve looking at the feasibility of different project options from a technical, environmental or legal perspective. It will also look at the costs and benefits of each of these options, not just in cash terms, but they might be difficult to quantify. And the risks associated with each option also need to be identified. For example, does the project depend on another project taking place? The São Paulo PPP Metro is a good example where the rolling stock PPP project had a significant dependency on a separate but interlinked civil works project that was being conventionally procured. Countries like Korea, Chile, Ireland, the UK have well-established methods for carrying out these sorts of economic appraisals of projects. And examining different options, often known as options analysis, is a powerful way to ensure that the different approaches are considered, a wide range of approaches is considered, and that the decision on the preferred option is underpinned with a rigorous process. This is a very important first stage for a PPP. because a PPP will only be successful if the underlying project itself makes sense. To underline this point, the decision about the project, therefore, is the first and primary decision. Whether or not it is a PPP is really a follow-on decision about the best way to procure it. The PPP decision is often taken too soon. The next step might then involve an initial screening of the project to see if it might make sense to take it forward as a PPP. Governments often use checklists, or there might be a policy limiting the use of a PPP to certain sectors that have been shown to work well as PPPs elsewhere. The screening would necessarily be high level at this stage because there's no point spending money on detailed preparation and assessment of a PPP if it's unlikely to work as a PPP. The areas to examine in this screening process mirror very much the 5 that I mentioned earlier on. So first of all, as a PPP, is it likely to be affordable? So are users likely to be able to pay for the service? Is the authority likely to have the budget to meet the payment obligations over the lifetime of the PPP contract? Second, is it likely to be commercially viable as a PPP? Given the risks that are likely to be allocated to the private sector, will the lenders and investors be prepared to finance the project? Will a significant number of good quality contractors be interested to bid for the project? Are the requirements likely to remain reasonably stable? And is it easy and feasible to express the output requirements of the private sector in contract terms? In fact, are these even achievable? A good example of this is the National Physical Laboratory PFI project in the UK, one of the early projects there, where the output requirements eventually were too difficult for the private sector to be able to deliver on, and this led to its termination as a project. Does the PPP route make economic sense? Now, it might make sense in bankable or affordable terms, but does it actually represent better value for money to carry out as a PPP than conventional approaches, other approaches that could be used to take the project forward? Essentially, the question here is the private party able to manage the key risks of the project more efficiently than the public sector? And are the benefits of doing so likely to outweigh the costs of preparing the project as a PPP and financing it as a PPP? Also, are there the skills and the resources available to develop this project as a PPP? And finally, will it still meet the fundamental needs of the project? You might have an approval checkpoint at this stage because you are likely to have to make a decision as to whether you're going to now spend significant resources preparing and developing and assessing this project as a PPP. Assuming that the project does potentially make sense as a PPP, the next phase, the preparation stage, will then look at these questions I just mentioned in much more detail. But it will also look at the detailed design of the PPP arrangement, the contract terms, the role of the private sector partner, the service standards, the payment mechanisms involved. It will also involve preparing for the procurement phase, preparing the necessary procurement documentation, preparing information for potential bidders, establishing the evaluation criteria that will be used to assess bids. These activities, especially the assessment and design of the PPP arrangement activities, are likely to have an impact on each other. So it's a highly iterative process at this stage. The end result is essentially to be ready to launch the PPP tender onto the market. Now, perhaps one of the most important issues to remember for this phase is that to execute this quite technically demanding and complex phase, the first action really should be to put in place the right team with clear roles, responsibilities, accountabilities and authorities. It might require having to contract and manage private sector advisors or technical experts to assist the public authority with this work. PPP units can play an often useful role in helping authorities manage advisors and conduct this process well. And the end of this phase is probably one of the most important quality control checkpoints because you're now checking to see if the project is ready for the market, everything is in place. The project makes sense, it's likely to attract a good response from the market, the project is still likely to deliver its needs, and that the team is now ready for managing the next phase. So when we move to the procurement phase, the shift now changes to a focus on ensuring that you have a strong, transparent and competitive process. There may be an initial market awareness raising exercise, and then there'll be the formal PPP procurement process, ending with signing a long-term commitment with a private partner that offers the best terms. The final check at the end of this phase will really be there to ensure that the project still meets the needs, that the deal makes sense in value for money sense and is affordable. And it'll confirm that the project authority is able to manage the next phase and the final stage of the project's life, that of managing the contract. Now, this final stage, the implementation phase, represents probably around about 80 to 90% of a project's life. But surprisingly, it is often the one that is least well planned for or budgeted for. Managing a PPP project is not a passive activity. There are, or maybe, performance-based payments that need to be made and managed. There are certainly project risks that need to be reviewed and monitored. Communications and reporting issues will need to be handled. And changes are inevitable. These may or may not be covered by the terms of the contract. Evaluations usually take place 12 or 18 months after the operations have commenced. Defining the evaluation criteria and who will conduct the review is important, and a well-designed contract will often identify the information that needs to be provided for such evaluation. So to conclude, the project cycle provides a systematic approach to help do the right things and ask the right questions at the right time when deciding on and delivering a PPP. It's really about good project and process management. Anyway, I hope this has given you a useful, though rather quick, overview of the PPP process and at least an idea of what to expect.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.